Okay, the Gemara is discussing where did this come from? Meaning, where did the Rabbanon come up with this notion? Where did they get it from? Where is it based on? That we have Shacharis, Mincha, Mar. Where did they come up with that? Right? Is that something that they just, I don't know, dreamed up out of the blue? Right? Especially if you hold like the Ramban, like I just mentioned a minute ago, that the whole thing is rabbinic. But even according to the Rambam, the Torah law is only for 10 seconds. Someplace along the line, there's no Shachris, there's no Mincha, there's no Mariv, there's no Siddur. All of that is only rabbinic. So where do they come up with that? Where did that come from? So our Gemara, it's a well-known Gemara, our Gemara brings two different opinions on this matter. One opinion says it's from the Avos. As a matter of fact, in these parshas that we were just working on, that we just read in the last day, last week or two, is some of the sources. For example, it says, Avram Avinu established Shachris. How do you know? Because in this past week's parsha, it says, when Avram Avinu was first lobbying God to save Sodom, and it didn't work, so it says that Vayashkem Abraham Baboker, the next morning after he was unsuccessful in defense of Sodom, the next morning it says Vayashkem Abraham Baboker, Abraham would get up early in the morning, and he said, and it says, and he went to the place, El Makom Asher Amad Sham, to the place where he stood there, right? The Chazal understand that to mean that he went there again to daven. And hence, the Chazal derive the notion of Shachris. He got up early in the morning to daven. So they derive the concept of davening from Avraham Avinu.
There's nothing to do with the data we had with Hashem the previous day, maybe there's 50, 45, nothing to do with that.
Nothing to do with that,
Immediately after that, it says that he saw that there was basically smoke arising from that very point.
That's right.
It's nothing to do with that. Right?
It is connected only in the respect that he went back to the place, obviously to see what was the result of what happened, but he reconnected with God anyway because it's the morning and we should connect to God. So, that is only rabbinic. That's a hint in the Torah that he did that. Okay, in next week's parsha, it's going to talk about Yitzchak. Right? We all know the famous story that Eliezer found Rivka by the well, and comes back with the camels, and Yitzchak it says that they're approaching, and it says Vayetze Yitzchak lasuach basada lifnos arav. Yitzchak goes out, lasuach basada. What does lasuach basada mean? Literally, it means to talk in the field. To talk in the field, eh? Who is he talking to? Okay? It doesn't say anything about talking in the field. I mean, presumably he didn't go out there for a private conversation on his cell phone. So who was he talking to? The answer is the Ribbanu Shalom. And being as it was Lifnos Erev, is towards evening, so the Chazal see that as a reference that Yitzchak Avinu had the notion or created the concept of davening mincha. And in a couple of more parshas from hence, it's going to say Yaakov went out in the famous Yaakov when he was fleeing from his brother Esav who wanted to kill him. It says Vayetze Yaakov mi Beersheva vayelech Haran in the beginning of Parshas Vayetze. He went from Beersheva and he went towards Haran, and he had the famous dream. And it says Vayifga b'makom, and he arrived at the place, right? Well, literally means and he like ran into the place, like Vayifga, like he met up with it. Okay, so Chazal have a reference here that they see that Vayifga can also mean daven, like approach something in prayer. And Chazal understand that Yaakov came up with the concept of Ma'ariv. Okay? So Avram did Shacharis, Yitzchak did Mincha, Yaakov does Ma'ariv. Now, there's all sorts of discussions as to why it was that each one did their thing. Why did Avram Avinu specifically do Shacharis and Mincha was specifically by Yitzchak and Yaakov did Ma'ariv? That's already, there's discussion amongst the commentaries as to why it is that each one was specifically to that one. But leave that alone for a minute. Let's go with the simple understanding. Comes out that the forefathers, the Avos, were Mesaken, brought up the concept. They initiated the concept of prayer. Now, let me just mention that could be that the forefathers conceived of prayer, but that does not mean that it obligated us. Because the forefathers, although they conceived of it and they perhaps did it themselves, it does not mean that obligates the rest of Klal Yisrael for the rest of time to do that. Okay, perhaps that it's a nice, it's good to emulate the Avos. Those are good people, and if you're going to copy someone, I would say that those should be high on the list. But meanwhile, it doesn't obligate us. It wasn't until many, many centuries later that the Anshe Knesset Agdola, the men of the Great Assembly, during the time of the early on in the Second Temple era, they decided to enact an obligation, rabbinic obligation to daven. It's based on the fact that we see references in the psukim that we just finished saying that of the avos that they davened Shacharis, Mincha, and Ma'ariv. So as a result of which the Chachamim, the Anshe Knesset Agdola, the men of the Great Assembly, came by and they said, so we see we have precedent from the avos. So you know what? It's not only a good idea, we're going to make it an obligation, a rabbinic obligation, that we should engage God in prayer 3 times daily, or at least twice. Ma'ariv is somewhat of a discussion that's going to be discussed later on in the parak. We haven't gotten there yet. But at least twice, perhaps 3 times. Good? You understand what I'm saying? Now, all of that is one opinion. That's Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Chanina. Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Chanina is of the opinion that it's really an enactment of the Anshe Knesset Agdola, and it was created to mimic or to copy the Avos, the forefathers, who we see references in these parashiyos that they in fact did that. Okay? Clear? That's one approach. So far, so good? Yeah? Okay. Next approach. The next approach is Rabbi Yisroel ben Levi. Rabbi Yisroel ben Levi says that it's not because of the Avos. It's because that we wanted to make prayer corresponding to the daily sacrifices that were in the Beis HaMikdash. That is to say, in the Beis HaMikdash on a regular day, there would be the morning sacrifice called the Karban Tamid Shal Shachar. The morning sacrifice. Every single day for centuries there was a morning sacrifice. And then every afternoon there was an afternoon sacrifice, another sheep. And there were Karban Musafs on holidays like Shabbos and Chol Hamoed and Rosh Chodesh. And there were other things that were done at night. And corresponding to these sacrifices, especially nowadays that unfortunately we do not have a Beis HaMikdash, so these are the things that's going to be in place of those daily sacrifices, and we actually time the prayer in accordance with the timing that would have happened for those sacrifices in the Beis HaMikdash. So at the time that the morning sacrifice was supposed to be brought, that's when we're supposed to daven Shacharis. The time that the afternoon sacrifice was supposed to be brought, that's when we're davening Mincha. etc. Right? You follow? So that's a separate thing. So it is not connected to the avos, according to this opinion. It's connected because we are trying to replace or at least add to the karbanos, the sacrifices that were brought in the Beis Hamikdash. Good? Clear? Okay. So now I'm going to go back quickly to a part of Sugya 1.6. I was planning on going to mostly Psalm 1.7. Let's go to Sugya 1.6. In the page that I handed out to you, on page 4, you will see in the last part of page 4, starting with the green letters Vitanya Kavasei. Do you see that? Page 4 of the formatted Gemara. Page 4 of the formatted Gemara. This. Okay? Now, the reason why I have it in color, in certain colors, is because that this is a proof. Vitanya Kavasei de Rabbi Yisroel ben Levi, and this is a brisa. Is everybody familiar with what a brisa is? We're familiar with that?
Yeah, it's statements of command, but it's not a mission.
Good, that's right. That's basically what it is. That's right. For whatever reason that Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, when he was collating the Mishnah, he chose not to take that into the Mishnah. So it was collected in a separate learning called brisa. Brisa actually literally means that, outside. That's what brisa is, an Aramaic word for outside the Mishnah. So the Gemara all over the place brings brisas to support what Amoraim say. It's one of the, shall we say, favorite games that the Gemara plays. You'll excuse my wording it every day. Whenever an Amora says something, an Amora meaning of the Talmud, post-Mishnah era, right? The Gemara will almost inevitably, if it can, support it or ask on it from an earlier source, namely a brisa, right? A Mishnah, a brisa, right? Because an Amora is not as authoritative as a Mishnah or as a brisa from the Mishnaic era, right? So it's not as authoritative. So if we have an Amora saying something, so we like to either back it up or ask on it from earlier sources. And the Gemara does this all the time. It's like almost breakfast, right? For the Gemara to do that, right? The Gemara always does this. So we had Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, who was of the opinion that the forefathers, who was of the opinion that the Chazal established the prayers corresponding to the daily sacrifices. And the Gemara says, V'tanya Kavasei de Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. And we have a brisa like Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, a brisa which is supporting Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi's opinion. Good? So far so good? Here's the brisa. Now the brisa is going to be worked out in a sort of a question and answer form. So that's why the first line is going to see red, because it's like, that's my question color. And then the next line is going to be an answer. And the next line is going to be a statement, as you'll see. Okay. So question number 1 of the brisa. This whole thing is a brisa. Mipnei ma amru, because of what did they say? Tfilas hashachar ad chatzos. That the morning prayer is until midday. Good, very good. Why did they say that the morning prayer can be done until midday? Well, says the Brachos, I'll tell you why. Shaharei, help me out. Shaharei, what? That behold, good. You might be able to. Actually, that's later. Okay. Shaharei tamid shel shachar, because the morning daily sacrifice karei v'holech ad chatzos could be brought and continued until midday. Oh, there it is. So since the daily sacrifice in the morning can be brought until midday, therefore you can daven chakras until midday. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, and Rabbi Yehuda says, no, ad arba shos. Rabbi Yehuda says it's until 4 hours. He disagrees. He's brought in the Mishnah in the beginning of the parak. He disagrees and he says, no, you can't daven all the way until midday. Midday is 6 hours, the end of 6 hours, because you'd split the daytime hours into 12, what they call even parts, or what they call sha'ot zmaniyot, right? I think that there's a fancy word called relative hours, or I'm sorry, seasonal hours, whatever you call it, right? Proportional hours. So he says you don't go all the way until midday, which is the end of 6 hours. No, ad arba shos, until 4 hours. And why does he hold like that? Shaharei, for behold, Talmud shel shachar, the Talmud, the daily morning sacrifice, karev holech, can be brought and continued ad arba shos, until 4 hours. Which means that Rabbi Yehuda disagrees not only regarding prayer, but regarding the daily sacrifice. Apparently there's a machlokas between the first opinion and Rabbi Yehuda as to what were the hours of the morning sacrifice. The morning sacrifice, according to the first opinion, could go until midday. And according to Rabbi Yehuda, the morning sacrifice could only go until 4 hours. Well, correspondingly, they're going to argue the same way about when the hour or the time of a prayer. When can you daven Shmona Esrei in the morning? According to Rabbi Yehuda, according to the first opinion, you have all the way until midday. And according to Rabbi Yehuda, you only have until 4 hours. Because it's directly connected to your daily morning sacrifice. Good? Got it? Okay. Next. Umipnei ma omru, and because of what did they say? Tfilas hamincha ad ha'erev, that the prayer of mincha could be until erev, until evening, which means until, let's call it Sugya, right? Until sunset, until evening. Why did they say that you could pray until evening? Answer, Shaharei, for behold, Tamid shel bein ha'arbayim, the daily afternoon sacrifice, karev holech, could be brought and continued ad ha'erev until evening. Huh? There we go again. Right? It's dependent on what the daily sacrifice, what the hours of the daily sacrifice are. So once you have the hours of the daily sacrifice, then that determines of when you can daven mincha. Rabbi Yehuda says, ad plag ha-mincha, until plag ha-mincha. Now, the Gemara, the Brisa later on is going to discuss what plag ha-mincha is. What is that? Are you familiar with that phrase, plag ha-mincha? Anybody familiar with that? You've heard of that? You've heard of that phrase, but maybe you don't know exactly what it is? Okay. Okay, so I'll just describe it to you briefly. Actually, we have a little chart here. Whoops. Sorry about that. Okay, imagine this is the beginning of the day. We'll call it sunrise. Right? So here's the proportional hours till 6, which is midday, right? So according to the first opinion, you could daven chakras that whole time, and according to Rabbi Yehuda, you could only daven chakras until the end of 4 hours. Okay? Now, let's talk about the afternoon here. Okay. The afternoon hours starts from chatzos and goes until the end, which we'll call shkia. Okay? Now, at 9.5 hours, which is the middle of the 10th hour, sometimes hard to get used to the terminology here. 9.5 hours means halfway through the 10th hour. Got that? Okay. So this line starts mincha kitana, the smaller mincha, meaning the larger mincha starts from chatzos until here. The smaller mincha starts from here until the end, from 9.5 until 12. That's the smaller mincha. This span of time from 9.5 to 12, which is, of course, 2.5 hours. Proportional hours, right? Good? Now, that's mincha katana. Plag ha-mincha is going to be a discussion in the Gemara, but we're going to presume the Gemara's conclusion, and that plag ha-mincha means the midpoint of that mincha, okay, of the smaller mincha. Now, if you do your math, you will know that if the mincha katana is 2.5 hours, midpoint is at 1.25 hours, right? So you add 1.25 hours from the beginning, and you will hit exact midpoint of the mincha katana, right? So actually, mincha katana is at 3/4 of the way through the 11th hour, or what the Gemara calls 10.75 hours, right? Because it's 1.25 hours past 9.5, which is 10.75, right? That's the midpoint. You see, I don't know if you can make it out from where you're sitting. That midpoint is plag ha-mincha, right? That's what it says over here. Plag ha-mincha, that's that yellow line, if you could see it. And that is plag ha-mincha. And Rabbi Yehuda is of the opinion that you can only daven mincha until there. You can't daven mincha here. Now Rabbanan say you can daven all the way until ha'erev, which we'll call Sugya, which is the end of 12 hours. Okay?
So what are we going to do with posik of Erev?
Lifnos Arev, I guess he's learning that it means until towards there, not all the way. Okay? But then again, this brisa is going with the presumption that it's not connected necessarily to the avos, but it's connected to the karbonos, as we'll see. So now,
What is the large blue line?
this?
Yes.
This is the beginning of mincha katana. Okay? This is mincha gedola, so part of mincha katana. Okay? Halfway through mincha katana is plag ha-mincha. That's assuming the Gemara will actually have a discussion a little bit later on, we haven't gotten there yet, about whether plag ha-mincha is a half of mincha or a midpoint. Okay, the Gemara is going to discuss that. When I say that this is plag ha-mincha, it's because it's based on the conclusion of the Gemara that plag doesn't mean a half, but it means the middle point of mincha, right? Because otherwise it could mean a span of time, right?
Half of a half.
Well, is it half, meaning a span of a half of mincha? So it would be a 1.25 hours is the first plag and the second plag, right? Meaning that it's a half of the mincha? Or is it the midpoint of mincha, right? So the conclusion is that it's the midpoint. So, but meanwhile, that is a discussion a little later on in the Gemara. We haven't gotten there yet. But Rabbi Yehuda is of the opinion that you can only daven mincha until plag ha-mincha. And why does he say that? Because the Talmud shall bein ha'arbayim. Next. Now, by the way, you'll note that nobody argues on that one. Right? Rabbi Yehuda does not have he has a dissenting opinion about Shacharis, Mincha, but not Mariv. Mariv, everybody is in agreement that could be done all night long. Now, it happens to be that the Mishnah says you should only do it until Chatzos, because you don't want to push your luck, right? If you already just delay, you're going to fall asleep, and then you're going to end up not davening Mariv. So but that's just a protective device that you shouldn't miss. But really, halachically speaking, you can do it all night long. Okay? It's clear? Yeah. Next. Umipnei ma amru, and because of what did they say? Shal musafin kol hayom, that you can do with a musaf all day long. Okay, so now we're talking musaf now. We're talking Rosh Chodesh, Shabbos, Chol Hamoed, something like that. And how the Mishnah, the Brisa is saying that you can daven musaf all day long. Why do they say that? Now by now you could probably guess. What's the Brisa going to say? Shaharei, for behold, Karban Shal Musafim Karav Kalayom. Because the Karban Musaf on those holidays can be brought all day. Oh, okay. Well, if the Karban can be brought all day, so that means that correspondingly you can daven all day, right? The Karban Musaf. So if you had a question, let's say for whatever reason on Chol HaMoed, you had to run to the office and you didn't get a chance to daven Musaf. I've been asked this question, right? And it's 4:30 in the afternoon, and I get a call. Oh, Rabbi Englander, I didn't daven Musaf. Can I still daven Musaf? So the answer is yes, at least according to this opinion, right? It's the way we pass me.
What if somebody davened Mikvah and forgot Musaf?
You can still daven Musaf, even after Mincha. Okay, now.
7 hours is only 1 hour to Chatzot, right?
7
hours.
Oh, okay, so you're a step ahead of me. Good, very good. Rabbi Yehuda disagrees, and he says ad sheva shos. No, you only have until 7 hours. 1 hour until after Chatzos, correct. That means until the end of the 7th hour. Shaharei, for behold, Karban Musaf, because the Karban Musaf, Karei V'holech, can be sacrificed and brought ad sheva shos. You could probably guess that one, right? Until 7 hours. Again, here you have, a machlokes between Rabbi Yehuda and the first opinion, what we'll call the Tanakama, right? The first opinion. One is the proper time for the sacrifices. And as a consequence of that machlokes comes the machlokes as to until when you can daven, because they're connected. They're literally, one is connected to the other. Okay? So far so good. So we just listed all the prayers, and this brisa clearly indicates, like Rabbi Shimon Levi said, that the sacrifices are connected to the davening is connected to the sacrifices. And according to each opinion, Rabbi Yehuda, the Rabbanan, whatever, right, each opinion is going to, depending on what they hold about the sacrifices, is going to tell you what the timing for prayer is. Okay, now the brisa does us like a public service announcement here. The brisa says, ve'ezoi mincha gedola. What is the large mincha? You were looking at my chart over there, right? What's a large mincha? Well, you think Englander figured that out? Englander made that up. Englander didn't make that up. Even Art Scroll didn't make that up. The Brisa told us. Ve'ezoi mincha gedola. What is mincha gedola? Mishei shos u'mechsul l'mala. From 6 hours and a half and on. From 6.5 hours. Now, in case anybody wants to ask a question on Englander, and asks, but Englander has it from 6 hours and on, not 6.5. Okay? There's a reason for that. It wasn't just because that I couldn't read. Okay. It gets into a larger discussion because although this brisa clearly says it's 6.5, there's a Gemara in Yoma, in Masechta Yoma, that says clearly that it's from 6. And I'm not the first person who wondered about that there seems to be a contradiction between our Gemara and that Gemara. Okay? According to that Gemara, the moment that the sun moves westward, even a minute amount, but it is in the western side, it has begun its descent. That's exactly right. Exactly. As soon as it goes 1 minute past high noon, it's already Mincha Gedolah. Okay? So there ensues a huge discussion amongst the Rishonim. How do you reconcile these two Gemaras? And Englander was not the first person who noticed that. right? Right? Not by a long shot, right? Tosfos discusses it, and the Rush discusses it, and all the Rishonim discusses. Okay, this is a big discussion, very involved discussion, and different explanations as to how to reconcile these two things. And the reason why I wrote from 12 and on is based on that Gemara in Yuma, and the way that many Rishonim, in fact, go with that. So that our Gemara is not, even though it says from 6.5 hours and on, it does not mean that that's really the beginning of Mincha Gedola is from 6.5. It's actually from 6. Why did they add in the extra half hour? We're not going to get into that right now. Okay? But meanwhile, whatever it is 6 or 6.5, that's where Mincha Gedola starts. Okay? Either it's 1 minute after midday or a half an hour after midday. Good? Ve'ezohi mincha ketana, and what is mincha ketana? Teisha shows from 9.5 and on and up. So as I put on the chart, that is 9.5 hours, which means halfway through our 10th hour. That is mincha ketana and on. So that's where mincha ketana is. Good. So the end of the brisa just basically just gives us some definitions as to what is mincha gedola versus mincha ketana. Okay. Good. So that's the brisa gives us some definitions. By the time we're finished with the brisa, it is very clear. First of all, one thing is obviously clear, and the brisa is saying it in very, very clear terms, that the prayers were connected to the karbanos, which is exactly why the Gemara brought this brisa to begin with, as a brisa Tanya Kavasei de Rabbi Yisroel ben Levi, as a brisa which supports the opinion of Rabbi Yisroel ben Levi, who said that the tefillos were established by the Chachamim to correspond to the daily sacrifices that we have in the Beis HaMikdash, and that is very clear from the brisa. Very, very clear. The whole brisa is basically stating that, right? And then the brisa goes into greater detail, but that certainly is the whole theme of the brisa. Good? Okay. All right. By the time we're finished with Sugya 1.6, it comes out, therefore, that we have actually two approaches. One is the approach that the Gemara said originally, that it was based on the Avos who established it. And one approach is that it is based not on the Avos, even if I don't assume that the Avos were the ones who came up with the concepts of Shachris, Mincha, and Mariv, but the Chachamim, the sages, in the time of the beginning of the second Beis HaMikdash, enacted the concept of prayer, Shachris, Mincha, and Mariv. Good? Either way, whatever way you go, whether it's the Avos, whether you go with the Karbanos, either way, certainly that the Anshe Knesset Hagdola, the people of the Great Assembly, they were the ones who enacted this, and it's only because of their enactment that we are obligated to daven, right? Because that's a rabbinic enactment, like many other rabbinic enactments, just like we read the Megillah on Purim, and we light Neiros on Hanukkah, right? Those are rabbinic enactments, and the Anshe Knesset Hagdola deemed it appropriate that we should do so, and that obligates us. So this is no different. This is essentially the same thing. The only question that our Gemara was discussing as to exactly where did they get it from? Why did they do that? What was the source from which they derived the concept, right? So either it's the Avos or it's Keneged the Karbanos. There may be some differences between the two, but from a halachic standpoint, it seems that there is virtually no difference. It's only more of a shall we say, esoteric difference or a conceptual difference, not in a practical difference in halacha, right? Because you're not going to say that, okay, if you hold it to the Avos, so then we don't follow the same time patterns. That's not true. We would follow the same time patterns anyway. So everybody holds of the time frames, and it's not a practical halachic difference between the two opinions. But it's an interesting discussion amongst the commentaries, especially the ones that are more hashkafic, of kind, to discuss why it is, why did Chazal decide that it should be based on the Karbonos? Or why was it decided to follow the lead of Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov? Right, so that's those are discussions. What is it that Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov are trying to tell us? Or correspondingly, what do these Karbonos stand for that we want to make it now that we can engage God in prayer, which is a very different thing, right? One is Karbonos, animal sacrifice, and one is myself just talking with God. Why are those? What is it that the sacrifice is supposed to do, etc., etc. It gets into hashkafic discussions that are perhaps a little bit beyond the pale of this class, but it's an interesting thing, and perhaps under a different venue it can be looked into. Okay, now we still have a couple minutes. Is that correct? Okay, so we're going to begin Sugya 1.7. And we're not going to have, time does not allow us to finish it, but at least we'll start it. Iboyalahu. Now you can look on your paper, on the other paper, which the other paper will give you some of the introduction and the word list. So now we can work on that. What does Iboyalahu mean? Right, it was asked to them, what I call a halachic query. Now, I just want to make a note over here, just as an aside. The Gemara has different types of questions. It's like, imagine that you go over to the rabbi, and you say, Rabbi, is this kosher? Now, the rabbi didn't say anything that you're challenging. You're just simply asking him. You had a question. Is this kosher or not? You go over to the rabbi because you figure he'll know better than you do. At least that's the theory, right? Right? So, take it from me, I'm a rabbi, and I don't necessarily know better, don't know that much better. But theoretically, the rabbi is supposed to know better, right? Okay. So you go over and you ask him, is this kosher? Okay. Is this forbidden on Shabbos? Not forbidden on Shabbos? That's an iboyalahu. That's a they asked the question, they weren't sure the answer, so they raised this question to the rabbis in the Beis Medrash. Now there are other types of questions. For example, the Gemara will often ask meisvei. Meisvei means an attack question. Meisvei means that somebody said something, and the Gemara comes out to challenge him and say, whoa, just a second here. I don't like that. I think I have reason to disagree with you, right? And I'm going to even bring you a proof from probably a brisa that's going to show that I don't think you're right. That's a challenge question. I'm trying to contradict you. I'm trying to show you wrong, okay? Iboyalahu is a par of a question. Basically, they brought up the following issue. They were not trying to knock anybody. We're not trying to challenge anybody. We just bring up the question in the Beis Medrash. Now, I will tell you, though, that Iboyalahu, the Gemara does not ask questions like we do. We ask questions out of amaratzus. Amaratzus meaning just simply ignorance. We don't know. So we go over to the rabbi because we don't know, so hopefully the rabbi does, right? That's the way we usually ask our Iboyalahus. The Gemara didn't ask questions out of ignorance. The Gemara asked the question. You can bet your bottom dollar that the Gemara thought of the sides over here, and the Gemara has a legitimate reason why I have a question. It wasn't just out of ignorance. I have a reason. It's like some people who go over to the rabbi and they ask a question, and it's not because of ignorance. They want to know what he says, and they are ready to discuss it with him. Oh, really? Why do you say that? I think that the halacha is differently, and I have a source for this. Okay, so then that's already a whole different level of discussion. You're challenging the rabbi, and you're saying, I have a question because I looked into it and I'm not sure what it is, and I have perhaps, differing sources that seem to lead me different ways. So what does the rabbi hold? And as soon as he says anything, I'm going to challenge him. Well, what about that? Right? That's a whole different thing. That's already a learned question, right? You follow me? That's the way the Gemara works. Okay. So Yibaylahu, they posed the following question. Rabbi Yehuda, plag mincha kama kamar, o plag mincha achrona kamar. Okay, let's see if we can figure this one out. What does that mean? Good, excellent. So the question it poses is Rabbi Yehuda, when he says plag ha-mincha, does he mean the first half or the last half? Okay, right? That's what it is. Now, let's make a point over here, a parenthetical note. Obviously, the Gemara is assuming that plag ha-mincha is not a midpoint, but rather a half, a span of time, not a point of time. You can't ask me a question, first half or second half, if it's referring to the midpoint. There is no first half and second half to a midpoint. Right? Therefore, the Gemara, when it asks the question, clearly presumes a position here. It already presumes that when it says plag ha-mincha, it means a half of the mincha. Not the half, but a half. And the Gemara therefore asks, okay, which half? First or second? Okay? Okay, that's clearly the Gemara's presumption in the question. Again, the question would mean nothing and would have no place if we understood already that the plag ha-mincha was a point in time rather than a span of time. Okay, clear? Okay. So now, given that, this is already somewhat interesting because when we're used to talking about plag ha-mincha, we're used to talking, like I was saying before, that it's a point in time. It is the midpoint of mincha getana, not a half of mincha getana, but a point, the midpoint. The Gemara automatically, you see clearly, is not presuming that. Okay. So the Gemara says, okay, so Rabbi Yehuda says plag ha-mincha, does he mean the first half or the second half? That's the question. Toshma, what does Toshma mean? Good, very good. I see you're familiar. Toshma, come and listen, come and hear, so I'm going to bring you a proof. Okay? That means that some of the people in the Beis Medrash who were listening to the question said, I can tell you what the answer to that one is. I have a brisa. Here's my brisa. What does the brisa say? Rabbi Yehuda says, plag ha-mincha achrona amru. It means the last half. Vihi, and that is achas esrei shos chaser revia. That is 11 hours minus a quarter. Otherwise known as 10 3/4 hours. That's why the Brisa talks. Okay, we're used to talking 10 3/4. The Brisa says it in a sort of what is somewhat unfamiliar to us, this idea of 11 minus a quarter. Okay, but it's right, exactly, same idea. Right, very good. Okay, now stop for a moment. Let's pause. Okay, the Brisa, the Gemara, clearly is going with the following approach. A, as we mentioned a minute ago, plag ha-mincha at this point in time is not a midpoint, it's not a point in time, but rather a span of time. Second, the Gemara says, is it the first half or the second half? The Gemara says it's the second half. And that is 11 hours minus a quarter. So it's 10 3/4 hours. So what does that mean? If you put it together, it becomes clearly obvious that what the Gemara is assuming, what this Bryce is assuming, and how the Gemara is taking it is that it means up till and not including the second half, right? So we asked, which half? First or second? Answer, second. But it means up till and not including the second half, right? Because that's what Gemara is saying. It's saying it means the second half. You can daven mincha according to Rabbi Yehuda until the second half, but it means up till and not including. That's why it says until plaga mincha, which means until the second half of mincha, but only the beginning of the second half of mincha. So therefore, you can only daven until the beginning of the second half. So when it says until plaga mincha, it means up till and not including. Good? Clear? That is what we're in. So in effect,
I see the chart.
sure. So in effect, here is, can you see it? The blue is the beginning of Mincha Ketana. That's at 9.5 hours, halfway through the 10th hour. Okay? Halfway is Plag HaMincha, that's the yellow. Okay? Plag HaMincha. That's at 10 and 3/4, which is 3/4 of the way through 11th hour, right? Now, according to what the Gemara is saying right now, here's the first half of Mincha, the first plag, and here's the second half. And we are saying, so when Rabbi Yehuda says until plag mincha, what did he mean? Did he mean the first half or the second half?
If he meant the second half, that's the same as the time.
Oh, so what's happening here is, if until the second half means up till and including, then there would be him and the Tanakhama would be the same. So clearly, we're assuming now up till and not including, right? So when I say ad plaga mincha, until plaga mincha, what I'm saying is up till and not including plaga mincha. So you go up till the beginning of the second half, but not including the second half. Hence, Rabbi Yehuda says, for all intents and purposes, it comes out that you can only daven until the midpoint of mincha.
That's how I understood Plag before.
Oh, everybody understands plag mincha as a midpoint. But I'm just pointing out that the Gemara's presumption in its question that plag is literal. It doesn't mean the midpoint, it means a half. So it's a span of time, not a point in time.
Up to 3/4 hours, but not up to 12 hours.
That's right, exactly. Okay? Were it to be until plag kama, if it would have been until the first half, then in effect the Rabbi Yehuda would have said that you cannot daven mincha in mincha ketana. You can only daven mincha up till 9.5 hours. Right? Because we are assuming span of time, and we're also assuming up till and not inclusive, right? Now, I'm harping on this point because later on the Gemara is going to come back and say, now, just a second here. 1 second. That does not fit so well into my other things that I am thinking. So, so I'm harping on this because I'm foreshadowing. The Gemara later on is going to pick up on this and say, whoa, just a second over here. What did you say? You said up till and not including span of time, up till and not including. Is that what you just said? Yeah, that's what I just said. Right. Just a second. I don't like that. Right. And the Gemara is going to attack that later on. Okay? But sometimes the Gemara, like a good boxer, sometimes the Gemara, waits for a good punch until it's a good time, right? Right now we're not. Right now we're in the middle of some other discussion. I'll come back to it. Don't think I'll forget. I'm not going to forget. I'm coming back to it, but not quite right now because we're in the middle of another discussion. But don't think you've heard the last of me. I'm not letting you get away with that so fast. Okay, but we're going to have to come back to that a little later next time. Gentlemen, pleasure.